You're welcome to imbibe as you wish, and you really don't even have to listen, but thank you for coming. Pen Pal Poets is the name, and the theme for our evening is Indelible Ink, and you do with that what you wish. We have 3 poets this evening, and then hopefully you will all stay for Linda and myself reading briefly, and a few open micers. So we'll begin with my interviewing. No, I don't think so. Introducing Michael Klein. His 3rd book of poems, The Talking Dog. I hate it. The Talking
Doesn't
Dog.
like you.
Sibling Rivalry Press. His first and second books were both, thank you, Lambda Literary Award finalists, and his first book, 1990, won the award. He has a new work set to appear in the next literary annual, Little Star, and writes a poetry column for the Los Angeles Angels Review of Books. He teaches in the law residency writing program at Goddard College in Vermont and lives in New York City, and also has offered a class recently that I was a part of, and he's good at it. Michael Klein.
That book is called The Talking Day, not Dog. I like The Talking Dog. I like talking dogs in general.
That's the next book.
Yeah, so that's the next book. I was nominated for a 1 year, because last year I have a book called Then We Were Still Living, which was my second book, and that guy, I was nominated for an award, and when he read the nominations he said, and Michael Klein for Then We Were Still Missing. So I'm used to this. Cartography. I'm dumb about the world. To me it always looks haunted, impoverished, especially in snow when it returns to black and white. And sometimes I look and see nothing but the elementary smoke rising from a human village, overpopulated and yet undermade. A woman from there is walking along the side of a road to the next village where she can live without burning. She's a story I make up to go with the map Andrew shows me of a place I've never been. Without the story, I can't make a meaning for the flat and lettered picture of a place. He said he can't believe I just don't see a map for what it is, or a tree being a tree. And sometimes our 2 spirits part exactly there. I want to think the world moves just beyond the name for what is holding it in. And he wants to think it's not going anywhere. I fell asleep in the sun, and he came to me standing on the smooth stones in the river and asked if being human could be made into vision, the more formal thing, not the species. Then I fell asleep again to look for something shining through pages of time, some animal. The Talking Day. This is a book actually of prose poems and poems. But my next book actually is going to be a whole book of prose poems called The Old Joy. Some lunatic, this is called The Talking Day, which is a title poem. Some lunatic with a gun killed some people at an immigration center in Binghamton, New York. Liz and her family live up there, and David, her husband, teaches in the middle school, which is close to all the action. The way in any small town, everything is close to all the action. And I called Liz to see if everyone is all right. She was in her car driving to elementary school to pick up Lily, her young daughter she brought back from China a few years ago. Lily was fine, but Liz wanted to move her outside the question of how to make sense of the broken pieces of someone with a gun walking into a public space and then firing. There's something called, I learned from a news report the day of the shootings at Virginia Tech, called the Talking Day, which refers to the day immediately following the day when something wildly violent happens. No one quite grasps the reality of the situation, and everyone spends that first day talking about what happened and reliving it as language not so much to understand the violence, but to make a kind of recording of it, talking about it, letting go of it, putting it down. And so I imagine it must be with Liz and Lily and David in Binghamton, New York today, letting something go. Liz is in her car after just having picked up Lily at school and driving back home through a town that suddenly makes no sense. And she's telling the story about what happened when a young man walked into the building with a gun. And for Lily, who has had a pretty serene, unviolent United States time so far, and whose endless joy has made her an adorable chatterbox, tomorrow could be her first talking day. Or if not tomorrow, some other day. We live in a talking day world. I don't prepare. Ghosts. The body is everywhere. He knew that when he let it go. Suspend, the room said, to the wire of mind as it instructed the body. I think I see him every day, just there at the edge of life, where it feels like work. I think he comes forward from his death, anxious to mark a wall. But I'm wrong. He wants to repeat a thing so he can live beyond his being taken. A habit, say, something faulty that won't catch light. There's Kevin, my twin brother, one day sober, trying to let it light a cigarette in the wind. The body is everything. I was struck today by a man and a woman in Yankee baseball clothing, sitting on the shuttle train that runs from east to west on 42nd Street, the most anonymous of train rides because we are in and out of each other's lives in one train stop. She was probably beautiful, the blonde in the Yankee shirt, but tonight she'd obviously been crying and her makeup was smeared and her hair was a mess from the crying. I kept thinking that maybe she'd been fighting with her hair because she had to resort to beating herself up since the person she was mad at wasn't listening to her. Anyone could see he wasn't listening to her. He, her husband, was staring off into the shuttle distance, awkwardly making eye contact with complete strangers, moving his head away from her when she wanted a simple explanation, and not engaging with her on any level. And there she was, dropped from a height, it seemed, down into that garish loneliness in public that both of them may have made all the time. But for this one moment, it was a hell he had made for her to live in. All she wanted was a simple answer all she wanted was an answer to a simple question, which seemed to me, when I heard it in her plaintive, half-crying voice, one of the hardest questions to have to ask someone who's supposed to love you. Why won't you dance with me? How difficult it must have been to hear a question like that and then have to give a real answer. How lonely it must be after the ball game to go home to a house where there is no dancing and the only question left to ask has already been asked. The horse considers his music, and always that music, at night or whatever it was, rolling over the day lashes and hitting the wilderness full flash with a dark mirror. Night drops its last oat after its last horse's mouth, and always these other music in daylight when no one is close enough to hear it because of money and the rotting earth and the other discomforts. Once I heard it between two trees. Everybody knows of some music sewn into life, but there's also music in the field where I'm recognized by the other horses who come closer to the ringing ground where the living was. Drinking money. In 1939, when my mother was 7 years old, the lyricist Lorenz Hart gave her a photograph of himself on which he had inscribed in midnight blue ink, "For Catherine Jacqueline, from Lorenz Hart, whose name will probably be forgotten by the time she's able to read this." Hart had been a friend to my grandfather, a vaudevillian. My mother kept that photograph for many years, and I remember reading it for the first time and thinking, what an extraordinary thing for someone to say to a child, as if childhood had in it the same kind of unpredictability and loneliness that fame did. I inherited that photograph after my mother's death and sold it to an autograph dealer on 18th Street in the 70s for drinking money. In the museum of saddest things I've ever done, that could have been the saddest. It felt like I was making fun of beauty. It was called The Poet there's a wonderful poet named Mary Duffel, who I've known her for many, many years, and I've sort of never read her until I was like about 10 years ago. She's been writing for 30 years, 20 years. The Poet from Mary Duffel. I'm putting your book by itself so it won't get mixed in with the usual stuff in the other books I have to carry around, like a day laborer who was always hungry to see something finished and only sees the empty field with the wind thrown over it. I've always left the game too early and can't remember now what it was I found in a field in Bennington, Vermont that qualified as being totally mojo enough to be used in a spell to make another man love me. It didn't even work. I was dancing then, the whole world was dancing, or in love with people who looked like dancers. And you were there before your book got written. And this idea to remain anonymous was there too, abiding us with mercy. And somebody said, don't get captured. And we looked up and said the same thing to what we thought was the future, there with its heartbroken electric eye, filming us from the sky. Mary Oliver, his new book is full of dog poems. And for those Mary Oliver fans, and this is my dog poem, and it's called There Is Where My Sympathy Comes to an Abrupt End, which is the title that I took from a conversation that I had with a wonderful writer named Banu Kapil, who teaches at Europa, among other places. But I loved the title so much that I said I'm going to use it, but I had no idea what the poem's going to be, and it's actually has nothing to do with the title. But I had to find a title for a poem that was untitled, so this is where my sympathy comes to an abrupt end for Banu Kapil. Sometimes the new dog just stands there, not looking for a toy or the small piece of bite-sized world. And her exaggerated head is cartoonily tilted at the lamp that is too high for even us humans to turn it off. And she's perfectly still in her bulldog-heated heart, with the snorkeling apparatus turned off for one startled minute. Is she breathing? As she looks for God or some other radiant ghost we live with, and says in her dog smarts, I know who I am in all of this. My dog is a good example for me. Everybody says that, but I really mean it. Because I never stopped long enough for exactly this tenderness of looking, because I am cruel and human and forget to take that island in the day. Jane Cooper always talked about when she wanted me to see the moving hour through a still life's version of it, and then be moved. I'm going to read one more from this book, and then I'm going to read a few new poems from the manuscript that I'm working on, if that's okay with everybody. Mm-hmm. This is kind of serious in here. Mm-hmm. Oh, good. Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah, okay. This is called The Track. It's in 3 parts. 1, there's a sacred place on the FDR Drive where a car can be the eye inside the East River. And the future of traffic and water is in the way upper left of what if this was a painting and I was alive in it. But instead of mortal cars into the sky, I'm thinking of the racehorse and what seeing means in his life. And if this were his race, he would know that desire holds more than time, which is why someone in the human class is always on a kind of rail to watch him. 2, things I didn't do when I lived on the racetrack. Read books, look at stars, call somebody, see a movie, see a play, get in a car, look at stars, call somebody, write a letter, walk into a store, eat vegetables, eat fruit, use a pen, look at stars, call somebody, things you didn't do, look for me. 3, the prophecy. You remember a trip south, the woman you went to live with for a while, the woman you told cancer when you didn't have cancer. On the racetrack, you said you were dying of the current dime because you didn't know how else it could be understood. What nobody can say. I am living of something. Poetry. Sometimes I take the world personally, and sometimes it takes me. That awful smell of meat and sunlight I walked home through, broke from dancing with the done-again men at 4 a.m. Once, one I loved him as long as the tall glass of water, and sometimes it takes me. There's an expression for when a ghost enters the room. It's close in here. How were you imprinted with love? A movie about a homosexual. I was living in Cambridge, which was basically a broad swath of loneliness wrapped around a magnolia tree. Cambridge smelled like coffee and brains, and it was quiet, like a madman, hanging around. I lived on Linnean Street across from the Brooks drugstore, and the person I talked to most of the time had the job of making sure people didn't park longer in the lot than the few minutes it took for them to walk into the store, wanting, knowing, buying, walking out to the lot again. He was discontent. His name was Cody, and he had a great body, but he didn't seem aware of it, and he spent his days in a little booth that he dressed up with terrible photographs of Celia Cruz, who was playing most of the time on the boombox Cody kept between his legs. Cody was a dreamer, and the notebook that I kept when I lived in Cambridge, the Cody mantra about not knowing what I wanted, got written down as another long afternoon sitting in the booth with another dreamer. So I didn't have very many friends. Cambridge is like a closed bank, lots of money, but you can't get in. Or it's like poetry, because a lot of poets live there, but I don't know very many of them until I didn't live in Cambridge anymore. And after I didn't live in Cambridge anymore, poets seemed to fall out of the sky like movie ending credits. Because I didn't have very many friends in Cambridge, I needed sex to make it seem as though I was having a forward-moving life. I was having anonymous sex at the Y, and helping a friend of mine in Provincetown come out of the closet with the telephone. Two things related only by the fact that they were ideas requiring quick action. My friend called me a lot, and I would have to keep reminding him that he didn't have to change anything about himself to be the thing he was becoming. And would eventually be, for every telephone conversation after that, a homosexual. My friend was afraid that if he didn't start acting faggy or over-the-top critical, other homosexuals wouldn't recognize him or take him seriously. And he wouldn't get to meet anybody or have more sex than he was already having, or anybody to go to the movies with. Which is one of the things about being a homosexual that he really liked, that he was really hardwired for, going to the movies with another guy. He had the sex part down, though. He was convinced, even though he wasn't really this kind of thinker, that homosexuals had an aesthetic that went along with the sex, something in italics. What he was looking for, asking for, was a homosexual mind to go with a homosexual body. I told him it was all there already, all of a piece. He wanted a mind that thought more about the homosexual than the body of the homosexual. You're opening a door, I said, not acting in a movie in which you play the homosexual. Here, let me help you, I said. Take this answer. A New York story. We were all standing in a corner office on the 34th floor of a building on 3rd Avenue in the 50s somewhere, watching in disbelief as the two towers, which we could all see perfectly, wafted down in the smoke of gray and sepia silence, and somebody said, "Did you ever think this would happen in your lifetime?" And nobody said anything because everybody had the same answer. And later, Ricky and I were walking up Broadway and ran into a famous composer who, because he lives in a city in his mind, wondered why there were so many people covered in dust walking up Broadway. And so we started telling him the story about a terrorist who got on a plane in Boston that later became 2 planes. I will read 2 more. And thank you for coming. And thank you for asking me. The motivation of the actor. My brother used to write poems to movie stars and talk about their public beauty as if he was the only person who could see it. He was an awkward devotee in that way, taking what was already the general consensus and thinking he was bringing the meeting to order. My brother thought fame was personal, and he suffered more than I did because his body suffered. His skin erupted and made him shy away from the day after the whole of it had already been about his skin erupting. At night I could hear the water running down and the prescription face scrub. My brother listened to the most difficult classical music ever written and read criticism when the rest of us were trying to figure out if O'Hara died on the beach or in the hospital after being hit by a beach buggy on Fire Island, a place where beach buggies don't exist. I watched my brother live, but couldn't touch the flame around his life. And I didn't want to be absorbed by art. I didn't trust art to throw me back. My brother didn't care what happened to him in the long, suffering act of paying attention. Art had everything. It grew dark, then light, then dark again, he'd tell you. And I will end with, I had a life on the racetrack. The racetrack poem is actually from, I was a groom for a Kentucky Derby horse in 1984 named Swale. And I wrote a book about it called Track Conditions, which is a memoir. And occasionally poems come to me about horses, but it's really, for me anyway, it's a real prose subject. I think poems about horses are automatically sentimental. Like, there's just no way around it, unless you're James Wright, in which or watching a horse do something remarkable. But they're very hard to write about in poetry, I think, because they're already embodied with so much. There's nothing you can add to a horse. That's it. It's like God. I mean, what do you add to that? And you can write poems to God, I suppose. But anyway, this is called The Lives of Horses. And the only reason I wrote about it, the only reason it occurred to me to write this is because, well, you'll see. It's not really about horses, but it's called The Lives of Horses. Somebody called me after reading my book about horse racing, written so many years ago that I don't even remember to remember it. And he wanted to talk about how he'd been on the track too. Jip tracks mostly, the way that I was in all those places at the beginning of something that took longer than I ever thought it would take in life, especially my life. And he wanted to know the names of the real people in the book, some of them, the daredevils. And most of all, he wanted to know whatever happened to Richard, my racetrack lover, the man who got me hitched to that dying star in the first place. So we talked a little, and eventually I was feeling sort of put upon, because here comes the reason for the call, which is almost the reason for every call like this. He's written about a book about the racetrack too. And he's not really a writer, et cetera, et cetera. And before he could officially ask, I said, of course I'll read it, but only the first 20 pages. And if I like it, I'll finish it. Is that fair? And he said, yes, it was fair. And then he said, I just want you to know that your book blew me away. And I said, how sweet of you to say. And then I said, as though I was looking into a beautiful room I hadn't been in for years, God, that was a long time ago. And then I said it again in my mind until I couldn't really hear what he said next. And then finally I said, I really appreciate the call, and I did appreciate it. I heard in the man's must have been 75-year-old Tallahassee drawl, the soul of someone who was in love with a kind of life that wasn't there anymore. And he was my brother in that ago life. No matter what racetrack he was working on, or what bar had to kick him out because the last call had been called and called and called. He was my brother in life, calling me to tell me that he stayed alive too. Wow. Thanks.
Thanks, man.
Thank you, Michael. Anybody want to go up there? Oh. I have to stop, I'm sorry.
We're good. You don't need to pay that, do you? Not yet.
Linda. I don't see Linda.
She went outside.
She left.
She stepped outside.
We'll see her, okay? And take off your coat. I'm sorry, I have to look after you. You'll understand why. Is that a good place for him to sit? Where do you want him to sit? I will keep you in suspense no longer. Neil Shepard is the author of 4 collections of poetry, This Far from the Source, Scavenging the Country for a Heartbeat, I'm Here Because I Lost My Way, and Tea Travel, Untraveled. He is the senior editor of Green Mountains Review. He teaches in the MFA program, writing program at Wilkes College. And he has been a very patient and kind mentor to me. Neil Shepard.
Thanks to Burt and Linda for inviting me, and it's fabulous to hear Michael's work. And now for something completely different, of course, but that's how it is. Each poet has her own work, right? This first poem is an autumn poem. It's called Autumn Flame. Fall morning after rain, corner of the porch, a web of desiccated flies, the spider, her back burdened with eggs. Between flagstones, sandy anthills, ants hauling aphids down into the underworld to suck them dry. Thunder rumbles in the distance, moving off, the last lightning bolts of summer gone. In the garden, cabbage leaves riddled with moths, mites on tomatoes. Everything with a mouth must eat, must drink the life from the smallest Christ. I rake the detritus of the day, fallen sunflowers, paper-thin vines of beans, husks of corn, drooping stalks of fennel, and begin the perfume burn. Once in the intricate web of gods, Prometheus was caught, his liver plucked for his forethought, his fire theft. I watch the flames wither what's left of withering. Watch the next flames to be fall leaves, flame in the trees. Demeter frets, Persephone waves and turns away. The maples convert their sugars, flame and flame. I'm going to lift this a little bit, see how that works. This next poem is called Blustery. It's a winter poem, and it responds to a line by Walt Whitman, "Oh, I think I could turn and live with animals," not racehorses perhaps. They are so placid and self-contained. And at the time, my wife was sitting back there, was doing research in the South Pacific, and I was suffering through a long, cold winter in Vermont. Blustery. Blustery, 25 below. Oh, Walt, I wouldn't go and live with animals tonight or anytime soon. How do they survive in their snowy lairs? How could I, for that matter, who hasn't taken the wild Swedish plunge every chilly night to thicken my fur layer by layer? I who doze by the fire with a phone to my ear, doze the whole new year listening to my wife in such weird zone-warping tropical heat, naked, whispering her desire for 50 below if it brings her home. That's fur of a different nature, Walt. Layer upon layer of love that glows, grows over us like a sunlit coat. Oh, we are hothouse flowers, Walt, naked and limply alive in a narrow equatorial zone. Otherwise, we die. Walt, we must make do with our lovely human hair. Fix the damn door. That goddamn thing has squealed like an unlubricated pig since summer. All it takes is I have neither the language nor the skill to tell you what it takes. Those hinges, flanges, double-hung things, those brass concatenations holding the bolts or whatever the metal locked in those squeaky clasps, spray it with